Management beyond either complete isolation or unrestricted sharing regardless of good intentions. 5. Cultural competence integration. The framework would ensure cultural competence across early intervention systems, implementing appropriate language capabilities, cultural knowledge, and community understanding, enabling accurate interpretation of behaviors within their actual context rather than external frameworks. This integration would transform traditional limitations through contextual understanding beyond universal assumptions regardless of professional expertise. This early warning system development would address the fundamental challenge where radicalization proceeds undetected until reaching advanced stages requiring security intervention despite earlier indicators visible to community observers. The resulting framework would transform prevention through sophisticated early identification, enabling appropriate intervention before crystallization into violent extremism regardless of subsequent pathway. Counter-radicalization capacity building. The framework would develop unprecedented community prevention capabilities. 1. Religious education enhancement. Recognizing inadequate religious knowledge as vulnerability factor, the framework would implement specific Islamic education improvement including curriculum development, teacher training, and learning methodology enhancement, creating genuine religious understanding resistant to extremist manipulation. This enhancement would transform traditional limitations through sophisticated religious education beyond simplistic instruction regardless of sincere intention. 2. Critical thinking development. The framework would establish specific critical thinking programs addressing vulnerability to binary worldviews, absolutist thinking, and simplistic solutions frequently characterizing extremist appeal, implementing cognitive skill development enabling nuanced understanding beyond black and white categorization. This development would transform traditional limitations through cognitive sophistication beyond mere content transmission regardless of factual accuracy. 3. Digital literacy integration. Recognizing online radicalization pathways, the framework would implement specific digital literacy development enabling critical information assessment, manipulation recognition, and effective navigation of extremist online content through sophisticated digital education beyond simplistic avoidance messaging. This integration would transform traditional limitations through online resilience beyond access restriction regardless of platform controls. 4. Positive identity construction. The framework would establish specific programs enabling positive Muslim identity development compatible with both Islamic tradition and citizenship responsibilities, implementing constructive alternatives to the identity resolution extremism frequently offers vulnerable individuals. This construction would transform traditional limitations through positive options beyond mere rejection of extremist alternatives regardless of counter-messaging quality. 5. Youth leadership cultivation. The framework would implement systematic youth leadership development creating legitimate influence channels, meaningful participation, opportunities, and constructive agency pathways addressing the purpose and significance needs extremist groups frequently exploit. This cultivation would transform traditional limitations through genuine empowerment beyond symbolic inclusion regardless of program visibility. This counter-radicalization capacity building would address the fundamental prevention gap where communities lack specific capabilities addressing vulnerability factors despite their critical position in early intervention. The resulting framework would transform prevention through sophisticated community capacity creating resilience beyond security agencies alone regardless of their operational effectiveness. Intelligence-led targeting of extremist networks. The counter-extremism concept would implement sophisticated intelligence approaches balancing effectiveness with ethical constraints. Network analysis sophistication. The framework would establish unprecedented analytical capabilities. 1. Functional role identification. Beyond simplistic leadership targeting, the framework would implement sophisticated analysis identifying specific functional roles within extremist networks including operational planners, financial facilitators, ideological guides, and recruitment specialists. This identification would transform traditional limitations through precision targeting addressing network functionality beyond merely visible leadership regardless of apparent hierarchy. 2. In network resilience mapping, the framework would develop specific methodologies assessing extremist network resilience capabilities, including redundancy structures, compartmentalization systems, and regeneration mechanisms, creating targeting strategies addressing actual rather than presumed adaptation capacity. This mapping would transform traditional limitations through sophisticated understanding beyond simplified organizational charts regardless of apparent clarity. 3. Critical node prioritization. Rather than opportunistic targeting, the framework would implement rigorous analysis identifying genuine network vulnerability points where intervention creates disproportionate disruptive effect through sophisticated understanding of actual rather than apparent operational dependencies. This prioritization would transform traditional limitations through strategic rather than tactical targeting despite the greater immediate visibility of the latter. 4. Temporal adaptation analysis. The framework would develop specific capabilities tracking extremist network adaptation over time, identifying evolutionary patterns, learning mechanisms, and adaptation strategies enabling anticipatory rather than merely reactive countermeasures. This analysis would transform traditional limitations through dynamic understanding beyond static assessment regardless of initial accuracy. 5. Cross-network relationship mapping. The framework would implement sophisticated analysis of relationships between distinct extremist networks, including cooperation, patterns, resource sharing, tactical learning, and ideological influence, creating comprehensive understanding beyond isolated group assessment regardless of individual network clarity. This network analysis sophistication would address the fundamental intelligence limitation where targeting proceeds based on simplified organizational understanding, opportunistic availability, or visible prominence despite limited strategic impact. The resulting framework would transform counter-extremism effectiveness through sophisticated analysis directing resources toward genuinely critical rather than merely accessible targets. Human intelligence enhancement. The framework would implement innovative human intelligence approaches. 1. Community trust architecture. Recognizing information flow dependence on community willingness, the framework would establish comprehensive trust-building mechanisms including transparency protocols, accountability systems, and demonstrated value exchange, creating genuine partnership beyond transactional relationships. This architecture would transform traditional limitations through authentic cooperation beyond coerced or purchased information regardless of monetary incentives. 2. Source validation methodology. The framework would implement rigorous source assessment addressing the motivation, access, reliability, and verification challenges inherent in extremism-related intelligence, creating sophisticated understanding of information quality beyond binary credible to non-credible categorization. This methodology would transform traditional limitations through nuanced assessment beyond simplistic acceptance or rejection regardless of apparent source credibility. 3. Former extremist integration. Drawing on Pakistan's sophisticated experience with rehabilitated militants, the framework would implement specific protocols incorporating former extremists into intelligence collection, implementing appropriate security measures, validation systems, and utilization boundaries, creating valuable insight beyond external observation. This integration would transform traditional limitations through insider perspective beyond external visibility regardless of technical collection capability. For handler capability development, the framework would establish unprecedented handler training addressing the specific challenges of extremism-related sources including religious knowledge requirements, cultural understanding, and psychological manipulation recognition beyond generic handling skills. This development would transform traditional limitations through specialized capability beyond general intelligence tradecraft regardless of basic professional competence. 5. Source protection sophistication. The framework would implement advanced source protection addressing the particular dangers in extremism contexts, including digital security measures, physical protection protocols, and identity preservation systems appropriate to the specific threat environment. This sophistication would transform traditional limitations through context-specific protection beyond generic measures regardless of basic security provisions. This human intelligence enhancement would address the fundamental limitations where technical collection dominates despite the irreplaceable value of human sources in understanding motivation, intention, and planning invisible to signals or imagery intelligence. The resulting framework would transform counter-extremism intelligence through sophisticated human source operations, providing insight beyond technical indicators regardless of technological sophistication. Technical collection integration. The framework would implement advanced technical intelligence capabilities. 1. Digital penetration sophistication, drawing on Pakistan's advanced cyber capabilities demonstrated during the May 2025 crisis. The framework would implement specific digital collection addressing extremist communication platforms, encryption usage, and operational security measures through sophisticated technical means beyond generic monitoring. This sophistication would transform traditional limitations through specialized capability beyond commercial technology regardless of general collection competence. 2. Social media analytics integration. The framework would establish advanced social media analysis capabilities addressing extremist network identification, recruitment pattern detection, and narrative evolution tracking through sophisticated algorithmic approaches beyond keyword monitoring. This integration would transform traditional limitations through analytical depth beyond surface content regardless of data volume capability. 3. Financial intelligence specialization. The framework would develop specific capabilities tracking extremist financial activities including cryptocurrency utilization, informal value transfer systems, and legitimate business exploitation through specialized methodologies beyond conventional financial intelligence. This specialization would transform traditional limitations through tailored capability beyond general financial monitoring regardless of basic tracking systems. 4. Biometric database sophistication. The framework would implement advanced biometric systems addressing the identity challenges in extremist contexts including multiple alias usage, physical appearance modification, and documentation fraud through sophisticated multimodal capabilities. This sophistication would transform traditional limitations through identification precision beyond basic biometric collection regardless of database size. 5. Technical human integration. Most importantly, the framework would establish specific methodologies integrating technical collection with human intelligence, implementing systematic combination, creating comprehensive understanding beyond the limitations of either approach in isolation. This integration would transform traditional separation through unified intelligence picture beyond capability compartmentalization regardless of individual collection excellence. This technical collection integration would address the fundamental challenge where advanced technological capabilities operate disconnected from human context understanding, creating data volume without corresponding insight. The resulting framework would transform counter-extremism intelligence through sophisticated technology leveraging human context for meaningful rather than merely voluminous information. Cross-border coordination mechanisms. The counter-extremism concept would implement unprecedented international cooperation addressing the transnational nature of contemporary extremism. Intelligence sharing architecture. The framework would establish sophisticated information exchange beyond traditional limitations. 1. Would standardized evaluation protocols. The framework implements specific intelligence assessment standardization across Muslim states, establishing common evaluation criteria, confidence levels, and source categorization, creating genuine information comparability beyond terminology differences. These protocols would transform traditional limitations through standardized assessment, enabling meaningful integration beyond merely collecting disparate analyses. 2. Graduated access framework. Rather than binary sharing, non-sharing approaches, the framework would implement graduated access levels matching information sensitivity with recipient capabilities, creating appropriate differentiation beyond Alornothing models, frequently preventing any sharing despite partial possibilities. This framework would transform traditional limitations through calibrated access, enabling partial sharing where complete exchange remains impossible. 3. Technical platform integration. The framework would establish secure technical infrastructure specifically designed for and Counter-extremism intelligence sharing, implementing appropriate security measures, verification systems, accessibility protocols beyond general communication channels. This integration would transform traditional limitations through dedicated infrastructure, enabling efficient exchange beyond ad hoc arrangements regardless of basic communication capability. For analytical exchange enhancement, beyond raw information sharing, the framework would implement systematic analytical exchange including methodology sharing, assessment comparison, and joint analysis sessions, creating genuine intellectual integration beyond data transmission. This enhancement would transform traditional limitations through analytical depth beyond information volume regardless of data quantity. 5. Source protection harmonization. The framework would establish specific protocols harmonizing source protection across jurisdictions, implementing common standards, mutual recognition, and shared responsibility, creating appropriate safeguards despite cross-border sharing. This harmonization would transform traditional limitations through consistent protection beyond jurisdiction-specific measures regardless of individual country safeguards. This intelligence sharing architecture would address the fundamental challenge where information remains fragmented along national boundaries despite extremist networks operating transnationally. The resulting framework would transform counter-extremism intelligence through sophisticated sharing, creating comprehensive understanding beyond national perspective limitation regardless of individual state capability. Operational coordination mechanisms. The framework would implement unprecedented cross-border operation integration. 1. Joint Operation Centers. The framework would establish permanent joint operation centers staffing officers from multiple Muslim states, implementing continuous coordination beyond crisis-driven collaboration through institutional rather than occasional interaction. These centers would transform traditional limitations through persistent cooperation beyond reactive coordination regardless of individual operation quality. 2. Synchronized operation planning. The framework would implement systematic operation synchronization across borders, establishing coordinated timing, complementary targeting, and mutual support, creating comprehensive rather than fragmented pressure on transnational networks. This synchronization would transform traditional limitations through strategic effect beyond isolated operations regardless of individual action effectiveness. 3. Capability complementarity implementation. The framework would systematically integrate complementary capabilities across Muslim states, leveraging particular strengths including Pakistan's human excellence, Gulf technological sophistication, and Indonesian community engagement expertise through deliberate combination. This implementation would transform traditional limitations through capability synergy beyond individual country self-sufficiency regardless of national resource levels. 4. Legal framework harmonization. The framework would establish specific legal protocols enabling legitimate cross-border operations, authorization mechanisms, implementing jurisdictional appropriate clarity, and accountability systems, creating proper governance beyond extralegal cooperation. This harmonization would transform traditional limitations through legal foundation beyond operational expediency regardless of security necessity. 5. Deconfliction architecture. The framework would implement sophisticated deconfliction, preventing unintended interference between separate national operations, establishing real-time coordination, information sharing, and operational boundary recognition. This architecture would transform traditional limitations through systematic prevention of conflicts, duplicate targeting, or contradictory actions regardless of individual operation planning quality. This operational coordination would address the fundamental limitation where operations remain constrained by national boundaries despite extremist networks exploiting border seams for sanctuary, resource movement, and operational flexibility. The resulting framework would transform counter-extremism effectiveness through sophisticated cross-border integration, creating comprehensive pressure beyond territorial constraint. Legal and judicial cooperation. The framework would implement unprecedented legal integration beyond traditional boundaries. 1. Extradition framework enhancement. The framework would establish specific extradition protocols addressing extremism cases, implementing expedited procedures, standard evidence requirements, and appropriate security measures beyond general arrangements. This enhancement would transform traditional limitations through efficient transfer beyond cumbersome generic processes regardless of basic extradition provisions. 2. Evidence standard harmonization. The framework would implement specific evidence standards harmonization ensuring judicial admissibility across jurisdictions, establishing common collection procedures, documentation requirements, and authentication methods creating cross-border prosecution viability. This harmonization would transform traditional limitations through consistent standards beyond jurisdiction-specific requirements regardless of individual legal quality. 3. Judicial communication channels. The framework would establish direct communication between judiciaries handling extremism cases, implementing information exchange, jurisprudential sharing, and procedural coordination beyond diplomatic intermediation. These channels would transform traditional limitations through judiciary-specific cooperation beyond general legal assistance regardless of diplomatic relationship quality. 4. Joint investigation teams. The framework would implement framework for multinational investigation teams with appropriate legal standing across jurisdictions, establishing authority, evidence procedural legitimacy, judicial recognition beyond collection and informal cooperation. These teams would transform traditional limitations through formally recognized cross-border investigation beyond unofficial collaboration regardless of bilateral relationships. 5. Digital evidence protocols. The framework would establish specific protocols addressing digital evidence challenges in extremism cases, implementing appropriate collection, authentication, and preservation methodologies creating judicial viability across jurisdictional boundaries. These protocols would transform traditional limitations through standardized handling beyond jurisdiction-specific approaches regardless of individual technical capability. This legal and judicial cooperation would address the fundamental challenge where legal processes remain nationally bounded despite extremist activities spanning multiple jurisdictions. The resulting framework would transform counter-extremism legal effectiveness through sophisticated integration creating genuine accountability beyond territorial limitation regardless of national legal system sophistication. Conclusion: Islamic authenticity and operational effectiveness. The counter-extremism operations concept represents transformative implementation of Muslim security architecture principles, demonstrating how sophisticated capabilities aligned with authentic Islamic approaches can address extremism more effectively than either purely securitized or exclusively theological approaches. This concept addresses the fundamental limitations undermining existing counter-extremism efforts through unprecedented integration across religious, security, community, and intelligence dimensions under coherent leadership with appropriate ethical constraints. The framework directly applies Pakistan's unique qualifications for Muslim security leadership, combining sophisticated counter-extremism experience addressing diverse extremist threats with religious legitimacy and democratic governance within Islamic framework. Pakistan's demonstrated ability to balance security effectiveness with ethical constraints, technological sophistication with human intelligence excellence, and operational capability with strategic vision provides precisely the leadership qualities required for this complex mission requiring both operational effectiveness and religious authenticity. Most significantly, the counter-extremism operations concept addresses all 6 critical security challenges facing the Muslim world, protecting territorial integrity through preventing extremist safe havens, preventing external interventions by demonstrating indigenous capability addressing extremism without foreign deployment, reducing economic vulnerabilities through addressing extremism's economic foundations, developing technological self-reliance through sophisticated indigenous capabilities, protecting cultural heritage by countering extremist cultural destruction, and overcoming strategic fragmentation through unified Muslim world action on this shared security challenge. Through this comprehensive approach, combining theological counter-narrative with rehabilitation programs, community engagement with intelligence operations, and cross-border coordination with legal cooperation, the Pakistan-led security alliance would transform counter-extremism effectiveness beyond both Western securitization and individual Muslim state fragmentation. This achievement would demonstrate the Muslim world's capacity to address its internal security challenges through collective action under Pakistan's leadership, without compromising Islamic principles or accepting perpetual dependency on external security frameworks consistently failing despite massive resource deployment. The counter-extremism operations concept thus serves as powerful demonstration of the book's central thesis, that quality defeats quantity through superior organization, doctrine, technology, and motivation. By implementing sophisticated capabilities aligned with authentic Islamic principles under Pakistan's demonstrated leadership, the Muslim world can more effectively address extremism through approaches aligning security effectiveness with religious legitimacy. This framework provides not merely theoretical concept but practical implementation plan, transforming counter-extremism from either excessive militarization or inadequate response toward balanced effectiveness through capabilities already existing but requiring merely strategic coordination under principled leadership. Chapter 90. Maritime Security. Operations. And it is he who subjected the sea for you to eat from it tender meat and to extract from it ornaments which you wear. And you see the ships plowing through it, and he subjected it, that you may seek of his bounty, and perhaps you will be grateful. Quran 16:14. Maritime security represents one of the most critical yet under-addressed dimensions of Muslim world security architecture. Despite controlling strategic waterways including the Persian Gulf, Red Sea, Eastern Mediterranean, and critical sections of the Indian Ocean, the Muslim world has historically lacked integrated maritime security capabilities commensurate with its geographical position and strategic interests. This chapter presents a comprehensive maritime security operations framework under the proposed Pakistan-led Muslim security architecture, demonstrating how sophisticated naval capabilities aligned with Islamic principles can transform maritime security effectiveness against threats ranging from piracy to resource exploitation, shipping interference, and environmental degradation. The May 2025 crisis demonstrated Pakistan's ability to implement sophisticated maritime operations including electronic warfare, coastal defense integration, and naval air coordination despite confronting a numerically superior adversary. Pakistan's balanced naval development, combining surface vessels, submarines, naval aviation, and coastal defense, into coherent maritime strategy, provides the doctrinal foundation for a Muslim world maritime security framework transcending the limitations undermining both purely national and extra-regional security arrangements. This framework operationalizes the central thesis that quality defeats quantity through superior organization, doctrine, technology, and motivation, demonstrating how focused Muslim capabilities under Pakistani leadership can secure critical maritime interests without requiring carrier battle groups or massive fleet investments. The maritime security operations concept addresses the full spectrum of contemporary maritime challenges, from traditional naval threats through non-state actors to environmental security and disaster response, recognizing that effective maritime security requires comprehensive integration across military, economic, environmental, and humanitarian dimensions. This multidimensional approach transforms the traditional limitations where naval operations proceed disconnected from economic interests, environmental concerns, or humanitarian requirements despite their interdependence in maritime security. By establishing institutional frameworks integrating these dimensions under coherent leadership, the concept creates unprecedented effectiveness, leveraging existing capabilities through strategic coordination rather than massive new naval construction. Anti-piracy coordination framework. The Muslim Security Alliance would implement sophisticated anti-piracy operations transcending the limitations of existing arrangements. Multinational task force integration. The maritime security framework would establish unprecedented multilateral integration. 1. Combined Task Force expansion, building on Pakistan's extensive experience commanding Combined Task Force 150 and 151, multinational counterterrorism and counter-piracy operations. The framework would expand these proven structures into comprehensive Muslim alliance operations with permanent command arrangements, integrated training programs, and standardized procedures. This expansion would transform existing ad hoc cooperation into institutionalized capability incorporating successful operational models within Islamic leadership framework. 2. Operational framework would specialization implement integration, deliberate the capability specialization among Muslim maritime forces, with Pakistan contributing submarine and special operations expertise, Gulf states providing advanced surface platforms, Southeast Asian nations offering archipelagic security experience, and North African states contributing Mediterranean operational knowledge. This integration would transform individual state limitations through complementary capabilities, creating comprehensive effectiveness beyond individual capacity. 3. Intelligence fusion implementation. The maritime security architecture would establish dedicated maritime intelligence fusion centers with permanent multinational staffing, implementing comprehensive information sharing, pattern analysis, and predictive assessment regarding piracy operations, support networks, and evolving tactics. This implementation would transform traditional intelligence fragmentation through systematic integration, creating comprehensive awareness beyond individual state visibility. 4. Command rotation architecture. The framework would establish systematic command rotation among qualified Muslim states, implementing experience-based qualification criteria, operational continuity mechanisms, and knowledge transfer protocols, ensuring both broad participation and operational effectiveness. This architecture would transform traditional personality-dependent leadership through institutionalized systems, maintaining consistency despite personnel transitions. 5. Standardized operational procedures. The maritime security framework would implement comprehensive operational standardization, including communication protocols, tactical procedures, boarding operations, and evidence collection, creating interoperability beyond technical compatibility. This standardization would transform traditional operational friction through systematic harmonization, enabling seamless multinational execution regardless of contributing nations. This multinational task force integration would address the fundamental limitation where individual Muslim state naval capabilities operate without strategic coordination despite facing identical maritime threats requiring collective response. The resulting framework would transform anti-piracy effectiveness through sophisticated integration, converting individual capability fragments into coherent maritime capacity beyond the sum of national components. Legal framework implementation. The maritime security concept would establish comprehensive legal architecture addressing the complex jurisdictional challenges in anti-piracy operations. 1. Islamic maritime jurisprudence development. The framework would establish unprecedented Islamic legal scholarship addressing contemporary maritime security within Islamic jurisprudential frameworks, developing specific guidance regarding piracy interdiction, evidence standards, detention protocols, and jurisdictional questions through authentic Islamic legal methodologies. This development would transform traditional limitations through religious legitimacy beyond secular legal frameworks alone. 2. Prosecution protocol standardization. The framework would implement standardized prosecution protocols across Muslim alliance members, establishing common evidence standards, chain of custody requirements, witness documentation, and judicial processes, ensuring successful prosecution regardless of interdiction and trial jurisdictions. This standardization would transform traditional prosecution failures through systematic legal harmonization, enabling accountability beyond geographical constraints. 3. Regional prosecution centers. The maritime framework would establish dedicated regional prosecution centers with specialized maritime crime expertise, appropriate jurisdiction agreements, and multinational legal staffing, enabling efficient processing beyond individual state judicial limitations. These centers would transform traditional prosecution backlogs through concentrated expertise addressing the specialized legal dimensions of maritime crime beyond general judicial capability. 4. Legal capacity development. The framework would implement systematic legal capacity building in member states, providing specialized training, procedure development, and institutional support enhancing national judicial systems to handle maritime crime effectively. This development would transform traditional limitations through capability enhancement, creating distributed judicial capacity beyond centralized facilities alone. 5. UNCLOS Sharia integration. Most importantly, the framework would develop sophisticated legal scholarship integrating United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea principles with Islamic legal frameworks, establishing coherent jurisprudence reconciling international maritime law with Sharia precepts through authentic scholarship rather than superficial juxtaposition. This integration would transform potential tension through genuine synthesis, creating legitimate legal foundation accepted across both international and Islamic perspectives. This legal framework implementation would address the fundamental challenge where operational capability fails to generate accountability due to legal system limitations despite successful interdiction. The resulting architecture would transform anti-piracy effectiveness through sophisticated legal systems, converting successful operations into consistent prosecution beyond the catch and release patterns, undermining deterrence. Comprehensive approach implementation. The maritime security concept would implement sophisticated integration beyond mere interdiction operations. 1. Root cause engagement. The framework would address underlying piracy drivers including coastal poverty, illegal fishing, toxic waste dumping, and governance failure through coordinated economic development, fisheries protection, environmental remediation, and governance support, specifically targeting vulnerable coastal communities. This engagement would transform traditional limitations through comprehensive approach addressing causes alongside symptoms. 2. Financial network disruption. Drawing on Pakistan's sophisticated financial intelligence capabilities, the framework would implement systematic targeting of piracy financial networks, enabling identification, tracking, and disruption of ransom processing, illicit maritime service providers, and onshore facilitators through coordinated financial intelligence operations. This disruption would transform traditional limitations through systemic approach beyond individual pirate interdiction. 3. Maritime industry partnership. The framework would establish unprecedented cooperation with shipping industry stakeholders including vessel operators, insurance providers, and maritime security companies, implementing information exchange, best practice development, and coordinated response through structured rather than ad hoc engagement. This partnership would transform traditional limitations through systematic private-public integration, creating comprehensive security beyond purely military approaches. 4. Technology force multiplication. The framework would leverage advanced technical capabilities including unmanned aerial vehicles, satellite surveillance, and artificial intelligence-enhanced pattern recognition, implementing cost-effective monitoring beyond traditional naval patrol limitations through appropriate technology integration. This multiplication would transform resource constraints through sophisticated technology enabling comprehensive awareness. Despite limited platform numbers. 5. Coastal community integration. The maritime security architecture would implement systematic engagement with coastal communities vulnerable to piracy involvement, establishing alternative livelihood programs, community-based early warning networks, and local security partnerships through sustained rather than episodic engagement. This integration would transform traditional limitations through authentic community partnership, developing indigenous security capacity beyond external imposition. This comprehensive approach implementation would address the multidimensional nature of maritime piracy beyond purely military response, developing sophisticated integration across security, economic, governance, and community dimensions. The resulting framework would transform anti-piracy effectiveness through holistic approaches, creating sustainable security beyond temporary suppression, repeatedly failing once patrol intensity decreases. Strategic choke point protection. The Muslim Security Alliance would implement unprecedented coordination, securing critical maritime choke points central to both Muslim world and global economic security, critical choke point security architecture. The maritime framework would establish sophisticated protection for key maritime passages. 1. Coordinated Strait of Hormuz security. The framework would implement integrated security for this critical passage carrying approximately 20% of global oil supplies, establishing multinational patrol coordination, traffic management systems, and crisis response protocols among littoral Muslim states beyond individual territorial approaches. This coordination would transform traditional vulnerability through systematic integration, creating resilient security beyond fragmented territorial protection easily disrupted during tensions. 2. Comprehensive Bab el-Mandeb protection. The maritime security architecture would establish integrated operations securing this critical Red Sea-Indian Ocean connection, implementing coordinated surveillance, patrol arrangements, and intervention capabilities among relevant Muslim states including Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Yemen despite their diverse security orientations. This protection would transform traditional vulnerabilities through multilateral integration, creating comprehensive security beyond bilateral arrangements. 3. Malacca Strait Coordination Enhancement. Building on existing regional arrangements, the framework would strengthen Malacca Strait security through systematic intelligence sharing, capability development, and operational coordination among littoral and user Muslim states beyond current limited arrangements. This enhancement would transform traditional limitations through sophisticated integration, creating effectiveness beyond individual capacity constraints. For Turkish Strait security integration, the framework would establish appropriate coordination respecting Montreux Convention limitations while enhancing security cooperation for these critical Black Sea-Mediterranean connections, implementing information sharing, emergency response coordination, and threat assessment integration. This integration would transform traditional constraints through appropriate cooperation, maximizing security within established legal frameworks. 5. Suez Canal Protection Coordination. The framework would establish systematic security coordination for this critical waterway, implementing integrated surveillance, response capabilities, and crisis management protocols beyond Egyptian national capacity alone through appropriate multilateral arrangements respecting Egyptian sovereignty while enhancing collective capabilities. This coordination would transform traditional limitations through capability enhancement, creating robust protection beyond national resources. This critical choke point security architecture would address the fundamental vulnerability where passages of vital strategic importance remain secured through fragmented arrangements despite their critical significance for both Muslim world and global economic security. The resulting framework would transform choke point protection through sophisticated cooperation, creating resilient security beyond individual state limitations regardless of sovereign authority. Freedom of navigation assurance. The maritime security framework would implement sophisticated capabilities ensuring legitimate passage rights. 1. Neutral framework passage verification systems. The would establish independent monitoring capabilities confirming adherence to international navigation rights through sophisticated surveillance, documentation, and verification systems, creating objective assessment beyond contested claims. These systems would transform traditional limitations through neutral verification, establishing factual foundation beyond competing narratives during freedom of navigation disputes. 2. Crisis de-escalation mechanisms. The maritime architecture would implement specific protocols addressing navigation incidents, establishing communication channels, third-party verification, and graduated response options, preventing crisis escalation through immediate clarification rather than assumption-based reaction. These mechanisms would transform traditional escalation vulnerability through systematic prevention, creating stability despite inevitable incidents. 3. Multinational escort capabilities. For particularly sensitive conditions, the framework would establish multinational escort operations including vessels from multiple Muslim states, implementing appropriate protection while demonstrating collective commitment beyond individual state action that might create unnecessary tension. These capabilities would transform traditional limitations through multilateral representation, creating confrontation dynamics. 4. Legitimacy beyond bilateral. Legal position coordination, the framework would establish coordinated legal positions regarding maritime passage rights, implementing consistent interpretation of international maritime law principles, creating coherent Muslim world approach beyond potentially contradictory individual positions. This coordination would transform traditional fragmentation through systematic harmonization, establishing clear expectations despite complex legal questions. 5. Civilian shipping protection. The framework would implement specific capabilities protecting legitimate commercial traffic during tensions, establishing appropriate convoy systems, safe passage corridors, and neutral zone protocols, enabling continued maritime commerce despite regional security challenges. This protection would transform traditional vulnerability through systematic security, creating economic continuity beyond the security-commerce separation, frequently disrupting both during tensions. This freedom of navigation assurance would address the fundamental security challenge where legitimate passage rights require protection while preventing abuse for provocative purposes, establishing sophisticated balance between security requirements and navigation freedoms. The resulting framework would transform maritime stability through nuanced approaches, creating appropriate distinctions between legitimate passage and potential threats beyond binary categorization. Coordinated deterrence implementation. The maritime established sophisticated potential. Security framework deterrence choke point disruption. 1. Against wood. Layered defense architecture. The framework would implement systematic coordination between naval forces, coastal defense systems, and air assets, establishing integrated protection, creating multiple engagement opportunities beyond platform-specific capabilities. This architecture would transform traditional vulnerabilities through defensive depth, creating resilience beyond single-dimension protection regardless of individual platform sophistication. 2. Strategic ambiguity protocols. While maintaining capabilities transparency with alliance members, the framework would implement deliberate ambiguity regarding specific deployment patterns, response thresholds, and capability limitations toward potential adversaries, creating uncertainty regarding intervention success probability beyond capability calculations alone. These protocols would transform traditional deterrence through psychological dimension beyond purely material factors regardless of resource disparities. 3. Demonstrated response capability. The framework would establish regular exercise programs specifically demonstrating choke point protection capabilities, implementing realistic scenarios, multinational coordination, and public visibility, creating credible deterrence through verified rather than theoretical capabilities. This demonstration would transform traditional limitations through established credibility beyond declaratory posture regardless of actual employment. 4. Forward presence coordination. The maritime security architecture would implement coordinated forward presence, ensuring continuous multinational Muslim alliance visibility at critical choke points, establishing rotation schedules, logistic support, and maintenance arrangements, creating sustained presence beyond individual deployment limitations. This coordination would transform traditional constraints through systematic presence management, creating continuous deterrence beyond episodic demonstration. 5. Strategic communication integration. The framework would establish sophisticated messaging regarding choke point protection, implementing clear capability communication, redline articulation, and consequence explanation, creating understanding without unnecessary provocation. This integration would transform traditional limitations through calibrated messaging, establishing appropriate deterrence beyond either excessive secrecy or provocative threat regardless of actual intent. This coordinated deterrence implementation would address the fundamental challenge where choke point vulnerability creates both actual security risk and psychological leverage opportunity despite their strategic significance. The resulting framework would transform maritime security through sophisticated deterrence, creating stability through credible protection beyond either provocative posturing or inadequate capability regardless of resource limitations. Energy shipping security concept. The Muslim Security Alliance would implement comprehensive protection for energy transportation essential to both Muslim world economic security and global energy markets. Energy Corridor Protection Framework. The maritime security concept would establish unprecedented coordination securing vital energy routes. 1. Persian Gulf Global Route Protection. The framework would implement integrated security for vital energy corridors connecting Persian Gulf production to global markets, establishing coordinated surveillance, response capabilities, and crisis management protocols along complete routes rather than merely territorial waters. This protection would transform traditional fragmentation through systematic coverage, creating comprehensive security beyond territorial segments alone. 2. Multinational escort architecture. For particularly threatened conditions, the framework would establish coordinated escort operations involving vessels from multiple Muslim states, implementing appropriate protection while distributing political exposure beyond individual nation visibility. This architecture would transform traditional limitations through burden sharing, creating sustainable protection beyond individual state capacity regardless of threat duration. 3. Energy shipping information sharing. The framework would establish dedicated intelligence fusion specifically tracking threats to energy shipping, implementing comprehensive information collection, pattern analysis, and predictive assessment regarding potential targeting, emerging methods, and vulnerability exploitation. This sharing would transform traditional intelligence gaps through systematic integration, creating comprehensive awareness beyond individual state visibility. 4. Critical infrastructure protection. The maritime security architecture would implement specific protection for energy-related maritime infrastructure including offshore platforms, loading facilities, and underwater pipelines, establishing appropriate security measures, response capabilities, and surveillance systems. This protection would transform traditional vulnerability through systematic security, creating comprehensive coverage beyond vessel-focused approaches regardless of infrastructure distribution. 5. Alternative route development. The framework would establish contingency planning for alternative energy transportation routes during disruption scenarios, implementing predetermined arrangements, capability prepositioning, and multilateral agreements enabling rapid implementation during crisis rather than improvised response. This development would transform traditional vulnerability through systematic preparation, creating resilience beyond primary route dependence regardless of disruption cause. This energy corridor protection framework would address the fundamental security challenge where vital economic interests remain vulnerable to disruption despite their critical significance for both Muslim world prosperity and global energy security. The resulting framework would transform energy security through sophisticated protection, creating resilience beyond fragmented arrangements frequently failing during actual threats regardless of apparent individual state commitment. Non-state threat countermeasures. The maritime security concept would implement sophisticated countermeasures addressing the diverse non-state threats to energy shipping. 1. Small boat swarm defense capabilities. Drawing on Pakistani naval experience developing asymmetric countermeasures, the framework would implement specific capabilities addressing small boat swarm tactics, establishing graduated response options, appropriate weapon systems, and tactical procedures effective against this distinctive threat beyond conventional naval approaches. These capabilities would transform traditional vulnerabilities through tailored countermeasures, creating effectiveness against specific tactical challenges beyond general maritime security regardless of platform sophistication. 2. Maritime improvised explosive device countermeasures. The framework would establish specialized capabilities addressing maritime improvised explosive devices including drifting mines, modified civilian vessels, and disguised explosive systems, implementing detection technologies, neutralization procedures, and preventive measures. These countermeasures would transform traditional vulnerability through specific capabilities addressing distinctive threats beyond general maritime security regardless of conventional naval strength. 3. Unmanned system defense integration. The maritime security architecture would implement specific capabilities countering unmanned maritime threats including surface, subsurface, and aerial systems, establishing detection technologies, neutralization methods, and attribution capabilities. This integration would transform emerging vulnerabilities through proactive countermeasures addressing evolving threat categories beyond traditional maritime security regardless of conventional capability. For maritime special operations capability, the framework would establish dedicated maritime special operations specifically trained for energy infrastructure protection, hostage situations, and ship seizure scenarios, implementing specialized equipment, appropriate doctrine, and multinational interoperability. This capability would transform traditional limitations through precision options addressing specific situations beyond conventional naval operations regardless of fleet size. 5. With non-attributable attack attribution, the framework implements sophisticated forensic capabilities establishing attack attribution despite deliberate obfuscation, utilizing technical analysis, intelligence collection, and pattern recognition determining actual responsibility beyond apparent perpetrators. This attribution would transform traditional uncertainty through systematic investigation, creating accountability beyond deniability regardless of sophistication. These non-state threat countermeasures would address the fundamental security challenge where conventional naval capabilities designed for state-based confrontation prove poorly adapted to asymmetric threats despite their increasing prevalence. The resulting framework would transform energy shipping security through sophisticated approaches, creating effectiveness against actual rather than merely theoretical threats beyond platform-centric security regardless of vessel numbers or displacement. Energy market stabilization integration. The maritime security concept would implement unprecedented integration between security operations and market stabilization. 1. Real-time information transparency. The framework would establish systematic information sharing regarding maritime security conditions directly with energy markets, implementing verified status updates, threat assessment communication, and incident clarification, reducing uncertainty-driven price volatility through factual foundation beyond rumor response. This transparency would transform traditional information gaps through systematic provision, creating market stability beyond security operations alone. 2. Strategic reserve coordination. The maritime security architecture would implement unprecedented coordination between naval operations and strategic petroleum reserve utilization, establishing release protocols, timing coordination, and market communication during significant disruptions. This coordination would transform traditional separation through integrated planning, creating comprehensive response beyond either physical security or market mechanisms alone. 3. Alternative supply chain activation. The framework would establish predetermined arrangements for alternative supply routing during disruptions, implementing rapid activation protocols, capability redeployment, and market communication, enabling supply continuity despite localized security challenges. This activation would transform traditional vulnerability through systematic preparation, creating resilience beyond primary route dependence regardless of specific disruption. For insurance framework integration, the maritime security concept would implement specific coordination with maritime insurance providers, establishing information sharing, risk assessment communication, and security verification, reducing premium volatility through direct engagement rather than external observation. This integration would transform traditional limitations through industry partnership, creating economic stability beyond security operations alone. 5. Private security protocol standardization. The framework would establish standardized protocols governing private maritime security operations, protecting energy shipping, implementing consistent rules for engagement, capability limitations, and accountability mechanisms, creating appropriate integration with official security operations. This standardization would transform traditional tensions through coherent frameworks, enabling complementary rather than potentially conflicting security provision. This energy market stabilization integration would address the fundamental challenge where physical security operations proceed disconnected from economic dimensions despite their inseparable relationship in energy security. The resulting framework would transform effectiveness through sophisticated integration, creating comprehensive protection addressing both physical and market dimensions beyond traditional separation, frequently undermining both despite apparent individual adequacy. Exclusive economic zone protection. The Muslim Security Alliance would implement comprehensive capabilities protecting legitimate maritime resource rights essential for economic development. Maritime Resource Protection Strategy. The maritime security concept would establish sophisticated resource protection capabilities. 1. Coordinated fisheries protection. The framework would implement integrated operations preventing illegal fishing in Muslim state-exclusive economic zones, establishing coordinated patrol patterns, information sharing, and enforcement protocols among regional partners beyond individual capacity limitations. This coordination would transform traditional vulnerability through systematic integration, creating effective protection beyond fragmented national efforts despite legitimate authority. 2. Hydrocarbon development security. The maritime security architecture would establish specific protection for offshore energy development, including exploration vessels, production platforms, and support infrastructure, implementing appropriate surveillance, response capabilities, and preventive measures. This security would transform traditional vulnerability through systematic protection, creating development confidence beyond territorial limitations regardless of distance from shore. 3. Seabed resource security. The framework would implement specific capabilities protecting seabed resources, including minerals, rare earth elements, and potential future exploitation areas, establishing appropriate monitoring, enforcement capacity, and technical expertise. This security would transform emerging vulnerability through proactive protection, creating resource conservation beyond traditional maritime security regardless of extraction timeline. 4. Environmental security integration. The maritime security concept would incorporate explicit environmental protection within resource security operations, implementing pollution monitoring, ecosystem protection, and sustainable management enforcement beyond merely commercial interests despite their economic significance. This integration would transform traditional limitations through comprehensive approach, addressing long-term resource viability beyond immediate extraction regardless of economic pressure. 5. Marine scientific research protection. The framework would establish specific capabilities supporting legitimate marine scientific research while preventing unauthorized intelligence collection under research pretexts, implementing appropriate verification, monitoring, and when necessary, enforcement measures. This protection would transform traditional vulnerability through sophisticated discernment, creating appropriate distinctions between legitimate research and intelligence activities beyond binary categorization. This maritime resource protection strategy would address the fundamental challenge where legitimate economic resource rights remain vulnerable to exploitation despite clear legal entitlement under international maritime law. The resulting framework would transform resource security through sophisticated protection, creating effective enforcement beyond paper rights frequently meaningless without corresponding capability regardless of legal clarity. Maritime boundary enforcement capability. The maritime security concept would implement sophisticated boundary protection transcending traditional limitations. 1. Integrated surveillance architecture. The framework would establish comprehensive surveillance combining satellite observation, aerial monitoring, surface vessels, and, when appropriate, submarine capabilities, implementing systematic coverage, creating awareness beyond individual platform limitations regardless of zone size. This architecture would transform traditional gaps through layered observation, creating comprehensive visibility beyond platform-specific capabilities. 2. Graduated response implementation. The maritime security concept would establish nuanced enforcement options ranging from presence and warning through boarding and seizure to demonstrate appropriate escalation. 3. Legal documentation sophistication. The framework would implement advanced evidence collection, ensuring enforcement actions meet judicial standards, employing appropriate documentation, chain of custody maintenance, and witness statements, creating accountability beyond mere interdiction. This sophistication would transform traditional limitations through evidentiary quality, enabling successful prosecution beyond operational success regardless of jurisdictional complexity. Complexity. 4. Multinational enforcement coordination. the maritime security architecture would establish specific protocols for coordinated enforcement in disputed or overlapping claim areas, implementing agreed procedures, appropriate command arrangements, and resource sharing, creating operational capability despite unresolved boundary questions. This coordination would transform traditional paralysis through practical cooperation, enabling protection despite legal ambiguity regardless of ultimate boundary determination. 5. Indigenous monitoring integration. The framework would systematically incorporate local fishing communities and coastal populations into boundary monitoring, establishing reporting mechanisms, communication systems, and appropriate response protocols, creating expanded awareness beyond official assets alone. This integration would transform traditional limitations through community partnership. Developing comprehensive coverage beyond purely military capabilities regardless of resource constraints. This maritime boundary enforcement capability would address the fundamental challenge where legal entitlements remain theoretical without corresponding enforcement capacity despite clear international legal frameworks. The resulting framework would transform maritime boundary protection through sophisticated capabilities, creating practical enforcement beyond diplomatic protection alone regardless of adversary sophistication. Maritime domain awareness architecture. The maritime security concept would implement unprecedented information integration, creating comprehensive understanding. 1. Multinational information fusion. The framework would establish dedicated maritime domain awareness centers with multinational staffing, implementing comprehensive information collection, analysis integration, and assessment distribution, creating understanding beyond individual state visibility regardless of national sensor coverage. This fusion would transform traditional fragmentation through systematic integration, creating territorial limitations. 2. Comprehensive awareness beyond. Technical collection integration. The maritime security architecture would implement coordinated technical collection including coastal radar systems, vessel tracking technologies, and remote sensing capabilities, establishing information sharing protocols, technical standardization, and analytical integration. This integration would transform traditional limitations through systematic combination, creating comprehensive monitoring beyond individual system constraints regardless of specific platform sophistication. 3. Commercial shipping integration. The framework would establish unprecedented cooperation with commercial vessels, implementing systematic information contribution, anomaly reporting, and situational awareness sharing, creating expanded coverage through thousands of additional observation platforms beyond military assets alone. This integration would transform traditional limitations through commercial partnership, developing comprehensive awareness beyond purely military capabilities. 4. Undersea domain incorporation. Drawing on Pakistan's submarine expertise, the maritime security framework would incorporate sophisticated undersea monitoring, addressing an often neglected dimension, implementing appropriate acoustic sensors, processing capabilities, and analytical expertise. This incorporation would transform traditional surface focus through comprehensive domain coverage, creating complete awareness beyond visible. Maritime dimensions regardless of adversary sophistication. 5. Artificial intelligence enhancement. The maritime security concept would implement advanced analytical technologies, transforming raw data volume into actionable intelligence, utilizing pattern recognition, anomaly detection, and predictive modeling, creating understanding beyond human analytical capacity alone. This enhancement would transform traditional limitations through technological leverage, developing sophisticated assessment beyond manual analysis regardless of information volume. This maritime domain awareness architecture would address the fundamental challenge where information remains fragmented. Despite its critical importance for effective security across all maritime missions, the resulting framework would transform maritime security effectiveness through sophisticated awareness, creating comprehensive understanding beyond territorial or technical limitations regardless of geographic scope. Disaster response and search rescue. Coordination. The Muslim Security Alliance would implement comprehensive humanitarian capabilities leveraging maritime assets beyond traditional security missions, multinational disaster response integration. The maritime framework would establish unprecedented coordination for natural disaster response. 1. Rapid Response Force Structure. The framework would establish dedicated maritime disaster response capabilities with predetermined command arrangements, specific vessel assignment, and rapid activation protocols enabling immediate deployment without complicated approval processes. This structure would transform traditional delays through institutional preparation, creating immediate response beyond diplomatic coordination regardless of disaster type. 2. Specialized capability distribution. The maritime security architecture would implement deliberate capability diversification among Muslim navies, with specific members developing particular humanitarian specializations including hospital ships, water purification, power generation, and heavy lift, creating comprehensive combined capacity beyond individual attempt at complete capability. This distribution would transform traditional limitations through specialization, creating comprehensive capacity beyond duplicative partial capabilities. 3. With integrated logistics architecture, the framework established prepositioned humanitarian supplies throughout the Muslim world with standardized access protocols, appropriate maintenance, and regular rotation, creating immediate availability beyond emergency procurement. This architecture would transform traditional limitations through systematic preparation, creating supply availability beyond reactive acquisition regardless of commercial availability. 4. Amphibious capability enhancement. Recognizing the particular value of amphibious assets for disaster response, the framework would prioritize developing appropriate vessels specifically designed for dual humanitarian security use, implementing practical designs, appropriate equipment, and trained personnel. This enhancement would transform traditional limitations through deliberate capability development, creating essential capacity beyond naval vessels poorly adapted to humanitarian requirements. 5. Civil-military integration protocols. The maritime framework would establish sophisticated coordination between naval assets and civilian disaster agencies, implementing joint training, standardized procedures, and clear command relationships, creating effective cooperation beyond organizational barriers. These protocols would transform traditional tensions through systematic integration, developing coordinated response beyond parallel operations regardless of organizational culture differences. This multinational disaster response integration would address the fundamental challenge where substantial naval capabilities remain underutilized for humanitarian missions despite their unique advantages for rapid response to coastal disasters. The resulting framework would transform disaster response through sophisticated maritime integration, creating effective humanitarian impact beyond traditional security operations regardless of non-military agency capabilities. Search and rescue standardization. The maritime security concept would implement comprehensive search and rescue capabilities. 1. Regional SAR responsibility delineation. The framework would establish clear search and rescue responsibility zones throughout Muslim maritime areas, implementing specific assignment, capability requirements, and performance standards, creating comprehensive coverage beyond national capacity variations. This delineation would transform traditional gaps through systematic organization, creating complete coverage beyond individual state limitations regardless of economic constraints. 2. Procedural standardization implementation. The maritime security architecture would establish standardized search and rescue procedures across all Muslim alliance members, implementing common communication protocols, coordination mechanisms, and operational methods, creating seamless multinational operations. This implementation would transform traditional friction through systematic harmonization, enabling effective cooperation beyond procedural differences regardless of national training traditions. 3. Civilian shipping integration. The framework would establish unprecedented cooperation with commercial vessels, implementing systematic communication protocols, capability awareness, and response coordination, creating expanded rescue capacity through thousands of potential platforms beyond naval assets alone. This integration would transform traditional limitations through commercial partnership, developing comprehensive response capacity beyond purely military capabilities. For technology leverage enhancement, the maritime security concept would implement advanced technologies improving search and rescue effectiveness, utilizing emergency beacon detection, thermal imaging, predictive drift modeling, and unmanned search platforms, creating capability beyond traditional visual search methods. This enhancement would transform traditional limitations through technological advantage, developing sophisticated operations beyond conventional approaches regardless of environmental conditions. 5. Mass casualty response capability. The framework would establish specific protocols addressing large-scale maritime disasters, implementing triage systems, multilateral resource activation, and coordinated medical evacuation, creating effective response beyond daily search and rescue capacity. This capability would transform traditional limitations through systematic preparation, creating resilience against catastrophic incidents beyond routine capacity regardless of scale. This search and rescue standardization would address the fundamental challenge where maritime emergency response varies dramatically across the Muslim world despite universal humanitarian obligation and international maritime tradition. The resulting framework would transform maritime safety through sophisticated standardization, creating consistent response beyond national variations regardless of specific location or flag state. Environmental protection integration. The maritime security concept would implement sophisticated environmental security capabilities. 1. Oil spill response coordination. The framework would establish integrated response capabilities for maritime environmental emergencies, implementing prepositioned equipment, trained personnel, and activation protocols, enabling rapid deployment to oil spills and similar disasters. This coordination would transform traditional delays through institutional preparation, creating immediate response beyond ad hoc arrangements regardless of responsible party. 2. Marine ecosystem protection. The maritime security architecture would incorporate specific marine protected area enforcement within broader security operations, implementing appropriate monitoring, regulation enforcement, and when necessary intervention, creating environmental preservation beyond economic exploitation. This protection would transform traditional limitations through explicit environmental mission, creating preservation beyond resource utilization regardless of economic pressure. 3. Climate change impact monitoring. The framework would leverage maritime assets for climate change monitoring in Muslim world waters, implementing systematic data collection, scientific cooperation, and information sharing, creating understanding beyond individual research programs. This monitoring would transform traditional limitations through naval capability leverage, developing comprehensive data beyond purely scientific resources regardless of research funding constraints. 4. Sustainable fisheries enforcement. The maritime security concept would implement specific capabilities enforcing sustainable fishing practices, establishing patrol patterns, inspection protocols, and equipment verification, preventing destructive practices beyond merely territorial enforcement. This enforcement would transform traditional focus through sustainability emphasis, creating long-term resource viability beyond immediate exploitation regardless of short-term economic advantage. 5. Environmental intelligence integration. The framework would establish systematic incorporation of environmental data within broader maritime intelligence, implementing appropriate collection, analysis, integration, and assessment distribution, creating understanding beyond traditional security information regardless of conventional mission focus. This integration would transform traditional separation through comprehensive awareness, developing complete maritime understanding, security, environmental division beyond artificial. This environmental protection integration would address the fundamental challenge where maritime security proceeds disconnected from environmental concerns despite their inseparable relationship in comprehensive maritime security. The resulting framework would transform effectiveness through sophisticated integration, creating security approaches protecting both human and environmental dimensions beyond traditional separation, frequently undermining both despite apparent individual adequacy. Conclusion: comprehensive maritime security through Muslim integration. The Maritime Security Operations Framework represents transformative implementation of Muslim security architecture principles in the critical maritime domain, demonstrating how sophisticated capabilities aligned under coherent leadership can address complex challenges more effectively than either purely national efforts or dependence on external security providers. This framework addresses the fundamental limitations undermining existing maritime security through unprecedented integration across anti-piracy operations, choke point protection, energy shipping security, resource rights enforcement, and humanitarian response under coherent doctrine balancing military effectiveness with Islamic principles. Pakistan's unique qualifications for Muslim maritime security leadership, combining sophisticated naval capabilities with extensive multinational operation experience through Combined Task Force Command and Pakistan Navy's regular participation in international maritime exercises. Pakistan's demonstrated ability to balance surface, subsurface, aviation, and coastal defense capabilities within coherent maritime strategy provides precisely the doctrinal foundation required for integrating diverse Muslim maritime capabilities into effective combined operations beyond individual platform limitations. Most significantly, the maritime security operations concept addresses all 6 critical security challenges facing the Muslim world, protecting territorial integrity through exclusive economic zone enforcement, preventing external interventions by demonstrating indigenous capability securing critical maritime domains, reducing economic vulnerabilities through energy shipping protection, developing technological self-reliance through sophisticated maritime domain awareness, protecting cultural heritage by securing maritime historical sites, and overcoming strategic fragmentation through unified Muslim world action on shared maritime security challenges. Through this comprehensive approach, combining anti-piracy operations with choke point protection, energy shipping security with resource rights enforcement, and disaster response with environmental protection, the Pakistan-led maritime security framework would transform Muslim world effectiveness in this critical domain beyond both fragmented national efforts and dependence on external security guarantors. This achievement would demonstrate the Muslim world's capacity to secure its maritime interests through collective action under Pakistan's leadership, without compromising Islamic principles or accepting perpetual dependency on external naval forces frequently pursuing objectives beyond Muslim world interests despite operating in predominantly Muslim maritime regions. The Maritime Security Operations Framework thus serves as powerful demonstration of the book's central thesis that quality defeats quantity through superior organization, doctrine, technology, and motivation. By implementing sophisticated integration of existing capabilities under coherent leadership rather than pursuing massive naval construction programs beyond economic reality, the Muslim Security Alliance can achieve maritime security effectiveness through strategic cooperation that individual acquisition programs cannot match regardless of investment level. This framework provides not theoretical concept but practical implementation plan transforming Muslim world maritime security from either inadequate protection or external dependency toward collective self-reliance through capabilities already existing but requiring merely strategic coordination under principled leadership.